have in the y-axis near the top, you're seeing what is correlated to persistent positive growth shocks, and near the bottom of the y-axis is persistent negative growth shocks. And the x-axis to the left, it's persistent negative inflation shocks, so deflation or disinflation. And then to the right is persistent positive growth inflation shocks. And when you examine where everybody largely is at, we just talked about real estate. We talked about 60-40. We could add private equity in here. We could add private credit. Like, they're all going to live in that top left. They're going to be highly correlated to a disinflationary growth environment, right? And so, 60-40 is also way up there with equities, because the 60-40, even though you only have 60% of equities, the risk contribution from equities is 90%. So whatever equities do, your 60-40 is going to follow. So the treasuries don't provide much protection in terms of bear markets. So the big blind spots clearly right now, when you see a period of inflation volatility, you see a lot of dislocations, right? So first of all, one of them is inflation, and therefore a possible solution might be commodities. You see here that commodities are the only thing on the top right quadrant that can protect or offset some of the losses here from 60-40. But also this type of inflation volatility leads to dislocations that oftentimes lead to bear markets that have negative growth shock consequences. And a 60-40, as we know, tends to have these very prolonged bear markets because, again, they're dominated by that equity component. And so there's major blind spots in traditional portfolios right now, both from the inflation side and the persistent bear market. Not these like liquidity shocks that we've experienced in the last 10 years, but rather an actual changing of the guard from a bear market perspective. So that's I think is an informative graph as well.
Yeah, it really highlights the where we've been over the last 10 years. And so you've had a market cap adjustment because those assets that are in the top left quadrant have done so well. And so people have probably allocated a little bit more there. And the allocations that they had 10 years ago have grown significantly in comparison to the other opportunities to invest. So unless you've been rebalancing judiciously and continuing to allocate to these other quadrant assets, which would have been a drag for the last 10 years, you would have faced significant pushback from the asset owner potentially, because they're not keeping up with everybody else who's just doing something that's more simple, easier to understand. And this comes back to, well, are we managing assets over 1 decade? Are we managing them over decades? How are we thinking about that? Are we making a prediction with the allocation to the top left quadrant versus preparation? So how might we think about being prepared for all the manifestations and then thinking about how we might impart some prediction or tilts to the portfolio? So it seems to be a pretty opportune setup for the last decade's darling to become the next decade's dog, potentially.